Hello, welcome to Devotionables, brief devotions for busy people. I'm Peter, and today we'll be looking at Acts 7. For a moment, I want you to think about a sermon that you have heard that has stuck with you. It may be one that you heard many years ago that the Holy Spirit used to change your life. Or maybe you remember it because of the setting that made the sermon stick out. Or maybe because of the way the passage was presented. I remember the first time a few years ago when I heard a sermon recorded by W.A. Criswell. It was titled, "The Scarlet Thread Throughout the Bible." Up until that time, I had never thought about using the Old Testament with the New Testament, about preaching the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament. In the past 15 years or so, this has become more prevalent in our evangelical world. Today, I want us to look at Acts 7 as that depicts Stephen's sermon. Stephen does what W.A. Criswell kind of did. He blends the Old Testament with the New, gives us a picture of the gospel with the lens of the Old Testament. But before we dive right in, I want to give a little bit of background of what's going on with Stephen. The book of Acts shows us the early church and their ministry. Jesus died, he arose from the grave, and has ascended into heaven. In Acts 6, we have just seen how the church has chosen 7 men to serve the church, and one of those men is a guy named Stephen. The end of chapter 6 shows Stephen being captured, which brings us to chapter 7. Where Stephen is surrounded by the religious leaders who are angry with what he has been saying. I want to briefly talk about Stephen's sermon and provide some application for our lives. When Stephen begins in chapter 7, he starts by giving a history of Israel's redemptive story, starting with Abraham. Now, these leaders in the council that Stephen is speaking to, they know Abraham and they know his story. They are not being told anything new that they did not know. Stephen is reminding those listening that God promised Abraham offspring, and those offspring to have their own land. But Abraham did not see that totally fulfilled. Stephen then begins to go through the story of Joseph and how the Israelites moved to Egypt. He shows how God had a hand in the Israelites residing in Egypt. He reminds those listening to him that Abraham began to have the many offspring that God had promised, but that once again, they were not in their own land. Stephen then goes on to tell of Moses and how Moses helped bring the people of Israel out of Egypt. As he goes through the story of Moses, Stephen tells those listening that the Israelites rejected Moses as a leader. When Stephen mentions the story of Moses, the picture for us as believers, Christ, comes to mind. He comes to mind because both of these men were sent by God. Both were redeemers, and both performed signs and wonders. Stephen is pointing out with Moses the coming of Christ. And we see that because Moses even mentions, when Stephen quotes him, about a coming prophet that has yet to come. Stephen then tells us about David and Solomon, and how God did not have a temple until Solomon built one. Stephen uses this to say that God does not need a house or a temple to dwell in, and that a physical temple will not last forever. He concludes by using Old Testament language to condemn the Jewish leaders. He wanted to show the listeners the repeated rejection of God and Christ. And then Acts 7 ends with Stephen being stoned to death by those listening. There are a couple things I want us to take from this passage. One, as we look through the passage, we're reminded of God's presence throughout the biblical narrative. We see God's presence through Abraham and Joseph, Moses, David, Solomon, and the Israelites. God was present throughout history, and he still is. Even though the Israelites rejected God, he did not leave and continue to draw them to himself. God has not left us, and he is still with us today. In fact, while Stephen is speaking in the face of death, he is in the presence of God, and the same is true with us. The second thing I want us to look at is how faithful Stephen was in preaching the gospel, even when facing being killed. Stephen was filled by the Spirit to preach the gospel to those listening, even when it was a message that did not want to be heard. For me, a people pleaser, this is very convicting. Now, I have not been faced with life or death when having the opportunity to share the gospel. But I still am afraid to share the gospel because I'm afraid of being ridiculed or laughed at or what someone else may think of me. Because of this Holy Spirit, we have the same gift and power to preach the gospel in any situation, just like Stephen. We have nothing to fear because even if we are sharing the gospel and that leads to death, the reward, heaven, will be great. I want to end with verse 58 of chapter 7. In verse 58, for the first time, we get a man's name that was in the crowd. It says this, "Then they cast him out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul." This young man who's being given these garments, whose name is Saul, spoiler alert, becomes Paul. Paul, who later becomes one of the most talked about people in the New Testament aside from Christ, starts off in a situation where he is killing Christians for telling them of who Jesus is. It's a small detail in this passage, but it is a great reminder that no matter who you are or what you have done, Christ can still save you. That person that you have been praying for years, Christ can still save. So preach the gospel boldly to all, because God is with us and he will not leave us.